Sup dogs, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmid, and today I'm going to be debunking the Kalam cosmological argument. I'm going to be decisively refuting it once and for all, and showing it to be intellectually bankrupt. In particular, I'm going to be arguing that it is invalid. So, what is my target? My target is this formulation of the Kalam taken from William Lane Craig. Premise 1, if the universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist, so therefore the universe has a cause. This is invalid, so the argument fails. It has the fallacious form of modus ponens. If P then Q, P, therefore Q. So in order to get a grip on why this is invalid, we need to understand validity. An argument is valid just in case the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. In other words, necessarily, if the premises are true, then the conclusion is true. The following is jointly impossible. It cannot be the case both that the premises are true, while the conclusion is false. So the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. There's no possible world, there's no possible situation in which all the premises are true, but yet the conclusion is false. So now I'm going to demonstrate why the argument is invalid. Remember our target and our target argument form. The target argument is this version of the Kalam, and the argument form that we're targeting is modus ponens. So let's prove the invalidity of it. So consider the predicate prem blue. Okay, so here's the definition of prem blue. If it's found in the premises of an argument, it has the same extension as blue. Okay, so extension, that just means that to which the predicate extends, right? It's the domain of application of the predicate. It's essentially all and only those things to which the predicate refers. So if it has the same extension of blue, well, then it just refers to all and only blue things. So for instance, the sky, the ocean, all sorts of things that are blue. So having the same extension as something is just referring to all and only those things. If in the conclusion of an argument, its extension is the empty set. So what that means is that it just doesn't successfully refer to anything. It's like phlogiston, or caloric, or witches, or a philosophically informed new atheist. Granted, the examples just given of things whose extensions are the empty set were nouns, right? I gave the examples of phlogiston and caloric and witches and whatnot. But we can easily modify that to include predicates. So for example, we can use the predicate witch cursed, right? So that would be a predicate which doesn't successfully refer to anything because there are no witches and hence there are no things which are witch cursed. So with that definition out of the way, we can now prove the invalidity of the argument form. So consider the following argument. Premise 1, if two prem blue things exist, then at least one prem blue thing exists. Premise 2, two prem blue things exist. So therefore, at least one prem blue thing exists. Now, notice, this has the exact same form, if P then Q, P therefore Q. But it has two true premises and a false conclusion. Look at the first premise. This is true, right? If two prem blue things exist, and remember prem blue is showing up in a premise here, and it's also showing up in a premise here, what it means then is basically the same thing that blue means. So if two blue things exist, well then at least one blue thing exists. That's true, right? And premise 2, two blue things do exist. Yes. Remember, if it's in the premises of the argument, then it does indeed successfully refer to things, in particular those blue things. And so it is true that if two prem blue things exist, then at least one prem blue thing exists. Premise 2, two prem blue things exist. That's also true. And conclusion, this is false, right? It is not true that, therefore, at least one prem blue thing exists, because if it's in the conclusion of an argument, its extension is the empty set. This is like saying, therefore, at least one witch-cursed thing exists. No, there are no witch-cursed things because there are no witches. And so we have a false conclusion. The key here is that prem blue, if in the conclusion of an argument, does not successfully refer, and hence it's false, but if it's in the first two premises, then it does successfully refer, namely to those blue things, and hence if two prem blue things exist, then at least one prem blue thing exists. That's true, and premise 2 is true, but yet 3 is false. But yet this has the exact same form as modus ponens. If P then Q, P therefore Q. So this is not valid, in which case the Kalam is invalid, and thus it utterly fails. Now, you might be thinking, oh, well, prem blue as a predicate is illegitimate. Well, I mean, no, it's not. It's not meaningless, firstly. It's perfectly intelligible. I mean, it's well-defined, and it's possible to use in both speech and thought. It's similar to grew and bleen from the philosophy of science literature. So these terms come from Nelson Goodman in the philosophy of science literature. Something is grew just in case it is green and discovered before 2050, or blue and discovered after 2050. And, contrary-wise, something is bleen if it is blue and discovered before 2050, or it's green and discovered after 2050. There has been substantial, rigorous discussion about such predicates in the context of inductive inference. And everyone on all sides takes it for granted that these things aren't meaningless, they're perfectly intelligible predicates. They're well-defined, you can use them in your speech and thought and whatnot. The trouble is delineating good inductive inferences, like all emeralds are green, from bad inductive inferences, like all emeralds are grew. After all, both of those have, so it seems, the exact same inductive evidence base, because it's still before 2050. And so all the emeralds that we've thus far encountered are both green, but they're also grew. What's important to note is that in the philosophy of science literature, these sorts of things are completely taken seriously. Like, these aren't illegitimate predicates, right? Sure, they might seem a little bit weird, but weirdness isn't at all an obstacle to something's being a legitimate predicate. We have all sorts of weird predicates in our language. The point for now is just that systematic philosophical discussion takes these sorts of predicates for granted, and hence they're not illegitimate. Moreover, there's nothing inherently wrong about sensitivity to sentential context. Remember the definition of prem blue. Its definition is indeed sensitive to sentential context, that is to say, the context in which it finds itself, namely the sentential context, the context of certain sentences like premises and conclusions. So its meaning is sensitive to sentential context, or its extension, we could say, is sensitive to sentential context. There's nothing inherently wrong about that. So consider, for instance, Frege's view. According to Frege, the extension of an expression depends on whether it's embedded in a description of a propositional attitude. So, for instance, it seems quite clear that we can say that Lois Lane believes Clark Kent exists, and Lois Lane believes Superman doesn't exist. Suppose that Lois Lane, for instance, starts becoming skeptical of Superman, and she's talking to Clark Kent. Is like, this Superman thing, he's got all these really weird powers. He's supposed to be able to fly and do all this sort of stuff. I don't think that exists. I think that's just like a trick, pulled by the deep state or something. So that seems perfectly fine. She can literally turn to Clark Kent, who she believes exists, and she can tell him that, hey, I don't think Superman exists. That dude that's really weird. I mean, goes around in underwear and saves people. I mean, that's just spook. This very point has led many philosophers to say that the extension of an expression, that is to say, that to which the expression refers, depends on whether or not it's embedded in a description of a propositional attitude. Because if these two expressions referred to the exact same thing, so some philosophers argue, well, then you would actually have both P and not P being true of that thing. Namely, Lois Lane believes of it that it exists, and it's not the case that Lois Lane believes of it that it exists. So, at least some philosophers have argued that the extension of an expression, again, that to which the expression refers, is going to depend on its embedding within a description of a propositional attitude. And so in these cases, this might refer to, say, the particular cluster of mental descriptions that Lois Lane associates with Clark Kent, like not being Superman, not wearing underwear, and saving people on the weekends and whatnot. And by contrast, Superman is going to refer, because it's embedded in a description of a propositional attitude, to certain meanings and descriptions and whatnot that Lois Lane associates with Superman. So wears a blue costume, wears underwear and saves people and whatnot. Again, even if you disagree with Frege's analysis and these other philosophers following Frege, and you disagree with their point that the extension of an expression depends on whether it's embedded in a description of a propositional attitude, the point is simply that there's nothing inherently wrong about sensitivity to sentential context. People don't object to, well, at least people don't tend to object to Frege on the basis of there being something inherently wrong about this kind of sensitivity to sentential context. Finally, there is no equivocation here, right? The meaning of the term is the exact same throughout. It means, if you will recall, it means this, the exact same thing throughout. If it's in the premises of the argument, it has the same extension as blue, and if it's in the conclusion, its extension is the empty set. So there's simply no equivocation, right? The definition is the exact same here, 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 and here. So it won't do to say that prem blue is illegitimate. And thus, we have decisively shown that the Kalam is indeed invalid and thus fails. Let's go on to another example. This one is from embedded conditionals. So, if a non-Republican wins the 2020 election, then if Biden doesn't win, Jorgensen wins. So this is true. We can suppose that we know that this is true. If a non-Republican wins the 2020 election, so that just means that we are zooming in our focus to Biden and Jorgensen, right? Joe Jorgensen, that's the Libertarian candidate for the 2020 election. Well, then if Biden doesn't win among those two, well, then Jorgensen wins among those two, right? So this premise is indeed true. We can suppose that we know that it's true. But premise 2, a non-Republican wins the 2020 election. That's also true, right? It's true that a non-Republican wins the 2020 election, namely Joe Biden. Conclusion, therefore, if Biden doesn't win, Jorgensen wins. Well, hold on a second. That is not true, right? If Biden doesn't win, it's not going to be Jorgensen that wins. It's going to be Trump that wins. Trump is the only other person who actually even has a chance of winning. Jorgensen doesn't have a chance of winning at all. So if Biden, just again, consider this claim in its own. This claim on its own is just false. It's false to say, if someone said, oh, if Biden doesn't win, I guess we can now say if Biden hadn't won, then Jorgensen would have won. We can do it either way. But it's just false. No, if Biden hadn't won, Trump would have won. That's just the truth of the matter. And so it's false to say that if Biden doesn't win, Jorgensen wins. But yet we have two true premises. We have if a non-Republican wins a 2020 election, so we're restricting our focus to Biden and Jorgensen, well, then if Biden doesn't win, obviously Jorgensen's going to be the one that wins. But then premise 2, a non-Republican wins. That's also true, but yet a false conclusion. And yet again, we have this kind of structure. If P, then Q, right? So this whole conditional statement admittedly is the Q, but it's still a Q. If modus ponens is valid, it should certainly be able to capture this. Again, we have two true premises and a false conclusion using this exact same structure. And so, once again, the Kalam is invalid, and thus it fails. So overall, the conclusion is that the Kalam is just decisively debunked. It's intellectually bankrupt. It's ludicrous. It doesn't even pass the first test of a good argument, namely being valid. It's not even valid. And that's just embarrassing, isn't it? Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed my April Fool's Day joke. Please smash that like button, subscribe, turn on that little bell for notifications. That's actually becoming more important than subscriptions nowadays, but oh well. And consider supporting me on Patreon. You guys get lots of super duper cool benefits like early access to videos, bonus content, unedited content, all sorts of super duper fun stuff, as well as access to lots of my papers and other stuff that I'm doing. And most importantly, share this with your friends. You might be able to trick some of them and whatnot, and prove to them once and for all that the Kalam is, after all, invalid. So send this to all your peeps who think that the Kalam isn't invalid, and maybe you'll be able to convince them. Anyway, I'm Joe Schmid. This is The Majesty of Reason, and peace out.